Good morning. I am Deborah Hearn Smith, a proud member of the board of Women for Change Indiana. I'm excited to bring you this discussion today on race and Indiana and our long history and our march toward inclusion and equality. Our speaker and our guest today is James H. Madison. He is the Thomas and Catherine Miller Professor Emeritus of History at Indiana University. An award-winning teacher, Jim is the author of several books, including Eli Lilly, A Life, Slinging Donuts for the Boys, An American Woman in World War II, Hoosiers, A New History of Indiana, and A Lynching in the Heartland, Race and Memory in America. The Midwestern History Association recently honored him with the Frederick Jackson Turner Lifetime Achievement Award. Jim's new book is The Ku Klux Klan in the Heartland. Jim, we're delighted to have you.
Thank you, Deborah, and I'm very delighted to be here and to have a small part. I'm trying to get my slides started here. Here we go. In what this great organization is doing, and I commend you, those of you leading Women for Change, those of you carrying forward the fight, which is so desperately needed, I believe, as a citizen in Indiana and in America. I'm going to talk about a very complex and complicated subject and not begin to do it justice, but to give you some things to talk about, and then Deborah and I can have a little conversation afterward, and I hope that I've given you and will have given you enough to prime the pump and get you thinking a little more and maybe even reading. I've sent ahead a list of some of my favorite things to read on this subject, and there's a lot to read, more coming out every day. So as Indiana Humanities says, read, think, talk. This is a tough subject. We've struggled with this subject since the very beginning of our history. And we Americans have often just not wanted to talk about, especially white people, assuming that if we don't talk about it, it'll go away. Well, of course, we know as adults that's silly. It's not going to go away. It's not going to go away in our lifetime. If we don't talk about it, then sometimes we create alternative stories. We make up stories full of myths that give us comfort. Some call it most recently patriotic history. I call it fake history. It's not going to work either. Now, in our history as Hoosiers, there are good stories. There are lots of good stories in our past. And I want to begin with one of the great stories, the 43 pioneers who met under this elm tree in Cordon, Indiana in 1816 and who created a new Constitution. I think they wrote some of the best words ever written on the soil of Indiana with these great promises of freedom, of equality, the basis of a democratic foundation for our state in 1816. But of course, if you turn the page and look at issues of race and of gender, you find that from the very beginning there were restrictions. That great promise of equality and of democracy was for white men, not for women and not for African Americans. A limitation that has stayed with us in all sorts of ways, less legally in the last few decades, but in all sorts of ways down to our present. At the foundation of our struggles with race is slavery, a subject that folks haven't wanted to talk about either often, and it keeps pushing itself into our view. Let me just quickly tell you that this is an achievement of evil unparalleled. It is America's great sin, I believe. It is the brilliance of building the largest system of forced labor in the history of the world. And we're certainly not over that. Indiana had a long and difficult struggle with slavery in all sorts of ways, but at the very beginning, including an effort by the leaders, William Henry Harrison, the territorial governor, and others, to introduce slavery into Indiana using the camouflage of indentured servitude. They failed in that effort, one of the most important steps toward equality in failing to bring slavery to Indiana in our long history. We have good stories in the anti-slavery folks in Indiana from the very beginning, in the Underground Railroad and abolitionist stories that are part of our history. That Underground Railroad, by the way, we now know was mostly run by African Americans, though white folks did play a very, very important role, such as the Kaufmans in Wayne County, but others as well. An important step, a good step in our history. As much as some Hoosiers may have been opposed to slavery, they were not in favor of equality. We have a public opinion poll, a very important insight into the way Hoosiers thought about race and about African Americans in 1851, when they voted to adopt a new state constitution. Included in that constitution was Article 16, which created a wall around Indiana, keeping out African Americans. Hoosiers voted by county. You can check the vote for your county if you're interested. A landslide vote in favor of keeping African Americans out of the state. All of this has a lot to do with the coming of the Civil War, fought by white men at the very beginning, but as they ran out of white men in this horrible, horrible, brutal war, leaders decided there was no alternative but to take on African American soldiers, keep them segregated in segregated units. The Indiana 28th U.S. Colored Troops are one of the great stories in our history of brave young Black men in blue. It's a dangerous thing to do, as Governor Morton and others knew, because you're doing two things at least. You're teaching African Americans how to fight and to use guns, and you're teaching them the possibilities of citizenship. I love this quotation from an Indianapolis reporter as he watched the 28th march through downtown Indianapolis. They're acting like they have rights because they're wearing Union blue with gold buttons and eagles on them. Here we have, after Reconstruction, the possibility of extending those rights. The reality in the amendments, the Reconstruction amendments, 13, 14, and 15, very important constitutional changes that gave the possibility of movement toward legal equality, a great possibility of a time pregnant with a possible new America during Reconstruction. The central question was nailed by this congressman from Terre Haute. Is it going to be a maintenance of white supremacy? And the answer in the end was yes, it is. We are going to maintain white supremacy. Indeed, we are going to increase the divisions, the separation, the Jim Crow discrimination against African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century, not only in Alabama and Mississippi, but in Indiana. In the construction, for example, of new high schools in larger cities, specifically built for African American students, specifically built to keep them from going to Shortridge and other high schools in Indianapolis. This, of course, is Crispus Attucks in Indianapolis, constructed in the 1920s. There is, by the way, a wonderful documentary film on Crispus Attucks by Ted Green. It's shown, done by WFYI. You can Google WFYI Crispus Attucks and it'll come up, and you should, especially if you're from Indianapolis, you should watch this wonderful documentary on this all-Black high school. All sorts of other ways in which Jim Crow thrived in Indiana. One of my favorite cases is this one. Two African-American sisters, the Burden sisters, walked into an ice cream parlor in downtown Marion, Indiana in 1917 and asked the proprietor for a sundae, an ice cream sundae. That's all they wanted. The Greek-American guy said, "No, we can't serve your kind here." And then he laughed at him. These were uppity sisters, and they filed suit in the local courts and took the case to the Indiana Court of Appeals with African-American lawyers representing. This is a very interesting story. They lost. They lost. The courts decided, yes, Louis Chochos could keep them from eating ice cream in his store, and he could laugh at them. African-American families faced a lot of issues and questions living their daily lives. On a road trip, where can we stop for a hamburger, for a restroom, for gas, for a hotel? And there's a book, and some of you now increasingly we know about this, the Green Book for African-American Negro motorists. Here's the first page. It lasts into the early 1960s, telling Black travelers where they can safely stop when on the road. And of course, we have in our history the tragedy of lynching. Again, not just in Georgia and Virginia, but in Indiana. African Americans lynched. The most tragic, the most iconic, on August the 7th, 1930, in Marion, Indiana. Abe Smith and Tom Shipp died innocent, never convicted of a crime, never having a trial, murdered by a vigilante mob, no one of which was brought to justice. We know more about these events like lynching, this fantastically impressive memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. I was there almost exactly a year ago and took these photographs. We know more about this in our monuments and memorials, which are changing and so important, I believe, in our movement toward justice and equality. And the Klan. As Deborah said, I have a new book just out on the Klan, so I'm a little obsessed by this. I'm going to try to get through it in just a few minutes because I want to have time for our conversation. First sentence of that book, the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana in the 1920s, it was as dark as the night and as American as apple pie. Here they are marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in our nation's capital. Here they are in an initiation ceremony, the men kneeling, ready to pledge their allegiance to the American flag and the burning cross of the Ku Klux Klan. Who are these people who joined the Klan in Indiana in the 1920s? Our comfort story that makes us feel better is to denigrate them as unteachables, as hillbillies. That's not true. We now know a lot about who joined the Klan, and that's not the people who joined the Klan. The people who joined the Klan were good Hoosiers in their own minds, middle class, lawyers, church women, Protestant ministers, businessmen. They were all white, native born and Protestant, and that made them 100% Americans. Proud Americans because they were fighting the fight to make America the kind of nation they believed it would be. To take care of those people who were not 100% Americans. Those people, them. We are us and they are them. They went into alliance with the Protestant churches in all sorts of ways. The Klan and the Protestant churches are in close partnership, an essential part of both groups in the 1920s in Indiana. They had many enemies, Jews, African Americans, and Catholics. Indeed, contrary to common myths, the largest enemy, the most dangerous enemy, for Catholics. That's a hard thing, and I don't have time to explain it today. You have to take my word for it. But anti-Catholicism runs through the Klan of the 1920s as it runs through the Protestant churches. And it's an important part of our history, excuse me, of struggling with us and them, of 100% Americans. I'd like to tell you that there was lots of opposition to the Klan. The truth is, it was small, it was late and slow in forming, but it was there from the very beginning. And those in Indiana who stood up to the Klan, as is always the case, provide us models, provide us evidence that there were Hoosiers who knew that this was not right. The Klan is dead by 1930 in Indiana as an organization. The ideals endure. We must always go to the basketball court to understand Indiana. Here's my great hero, Bill Garrett from Shelbyville, Indiana, All-American at IU. Everywhere Bill Garrett played, from Ann Arbor to Evanston, he was the only African-American on the court. And just a couple of years later, Branch McCracken's team won the NCAA championship with only white players because I guess he didn't know about the Crispus Attucks team up the road, one of some of the finest players in the state and in the country. Remind you that we went to war against fascism in 1941 with an all-segregated military. Black troops separate from and doing the least desirable work. There's always been opposition. There's always been men and women in Indiana who have stood up and tried to change what was. The best example, the most powerful, is the NAACP, a civil rights organization I think inadequately appreciated today, but in this day, in this old day, very, very important. Branches across the state. This one in Indianapolis, standing up to the Klan in the 1920s. Branches led by Black ministers, by Black lawyers, and by Black women. Black women played an exceedingly important role in NAACP local branches. I've read the correspondence in the Library of Congress, and sometimes it's typed, and sometimes it's in pencil written on scraps of paper, but you can find in all of these branches women and men of great courage and great sophistication in standing up to racism. Here's my favorite. This is the woman who organized the branch in Marion, Indiana. And when the lynchings occurred, she stood up and she did her darndest. She worked and worked and worked to find justice. Flossie Bailey, Mrs. Catherine T. Bailey, failed in that effort. She was ahead of her time in so many ways. Ahead of her time before what we know as the civil rights movement of the 1960s. This too, I think, is sometimes denigrated unfairly today. This is a very important part of our past and our present. Of course, it wasn't fully successful. Of course, there were problems and failures. But I believe this movement of people marching in downtown Indianapolis and across our state is a very important part of our heritage. If you know America, you know that a movement like the Civil Rights Movement is going to produce a backlash, and it did by 1964. George Corley Wallace, the Alabama segregationist, came to Indiana to preach his version of segregation, to preach his gospel that these people, those people, are getting out of their place, that they're getting too much. We've got to turn back. He was a pioneer in using the politics of rage. He was a pioneer in using the politics of coded words, of saying these things in Indiana, a bit unlike he said them in Alabama, to make them more palatable to white Hoosiers. And he did very well in that 1964 election. Not without protest, as these African-American members of the NAACP are doing in front of his headquarters hotel in downtown Indianapolis. I show this picture also to show you what that flag of treason represents. Some would like to say it's a flag of heritage. It has no meaning. It's about our cause in the Civil War, the so-called war between the states. That is, the technical word for that, folks, is bullshit. That flag is the flag of white supremacy. It always has been. It wasn't really at all popular until the civil rights movement came along and Southerners and Northerners discovered that they could wave that flag in a way to express their support of white supremacy. The space created by this backlash allowed remnants of the Klan in very small numbers to return to Indiana, to march and to protest. There were lots and lots of parades and rallies by a handful of Klan members outnumbered by their opponents, beginning in the 60s and lasting down to our own time. This is my favorite photograph. You have the elements here. Already this kind of combat gear with the Klan insignia and the Confederate flag on the sleeve. And then my favorite poster of all time, this fellow to the left, he's a Hoosier boy. He's a very nice Hoosier boy. And he's not saying we hate you, we want you dead, we want to lynch you. He's saying it's nice to be white. But many of you will know that the word "its" is a hard word to spell correctly. I've never seen it spelled I''Ts. I love this photograph. So the Klan today is dead. Its descendants live. Its descendants are not the people who put on robes. They are truly the Great Unteachables. Its descendants, I believe, are ordinary Americans, Americans who sometimes stand before us and speak in nice suits and ties, in silk blouses, Americans who have these kinds of qualities as I understand them today, convinced of their goodness, not convinced of the rule of law or that it applies to them or their people, eager to divide the world into us and yet them, using the same techniques, even the same words sometimes that the Klan used in the 1920s. Americans who deny white male privilege. Americans who are fearful of changing times, and the times are always changing all around us. If it's one thing a historian knows, it knows that we know the times are changing. Here's my favorite example, back to the basketball court again. So, you know, as a young guy, I played basketball. I never could have imagined that a girl could run the court and shoot and pass the way Stephanie White did, an All-American. And yes, I'm an IU guy, but I chose a Purdue hero here at Purdue University. Changing times. What do we do about this? Well, as a historian, I say we need to pay more attention to our history, not to our myths, not to our patriotic fake versions of our past, but to our real past. I love this sculpture in the Meyer Sculpture Garden outside of Grand Rapids, Michigan. The head is covered, the eyes are covered by these cords that bind the book of history over the ears, so that the figure cannot see, cannot read, cannot hear. I believe we need to read and learn and think about our past, our real past, that includes lots of great heroic stories of courage and achievement, but stories also like the ones I've been telling you now. And so the question is, what is America? Is it this America of the Ku Klux Klan and its ideals? Is it the America that our greatest Hoosier, greatest American of all time believed in? It was Lincoln who said, and I still want to believe this, that America is the last best hope of earth, not the best of the world, but the best hope of the world. And I hope that's true. I hope that's true for my 4 grandchildren, who I very much want to grow up in America that is closer to liberty and justice for all than it is today. So my email address is right here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. I refer you again to the list of readings that I sent ahead, and hope that Deborah and I can have, I know, a very good conversation. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I'd like to start my kind of questioning our discussion with a little personal privilege of my own background in Indiana, because there's one thing to have the academic clean version, and then I'd like to just say that some of the African-American population in Indiana, like me, have been here for a long time. Both of my grandmothers were born in Indiana. So I don't have the history of coming from the South, but having been here for several generations. Understand one of my grandmothers, in fact, I have her marriage certificate from Marion, Indiana, in the early 1900s. My grandmothers both graduated from Shortridge High School, which is really unusual. But the reality is there weren't enough African Americans in Indiana for the white population to be concerned. But as it grew and they built Attucks, then that whole generation of my parents went to Attucks. And then when I came along, we were desegregating, so I went back to Shortridge. So it kind of shows how Indiana has gone back and forth. But I think most of us were not taught in school the real history of the racial climate of Indiana. I don't think most of us realized that the Green Book, which was, we thought, for traveling south, included Indiana. We'd like to brag about Indiana never having been a slave state, but we were certainly considered a state not friendly to African Americans. And kind of wanted to really start there. Can you talk a little bit more about those early days and how the population of Indiana, especially African Americans, when it began to grow enough that the history will show they really became concerned, and how they built attics and some of the other schools? Were there things going on that made it concerning that we now have too many?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Deborah. What you just said there in just a couple of minutes was full of so much meaning and significance. And we could talk about every one of those issues for a long time. Before I answer your immediate question, let me just say you mentioned history teaching, and you're absolutely right. Those of a certain age should maybe go back and look at, and you can probably find examples of, the history books that were used in Indiana classrooms in the 1950s and 60s. If you haven't looked at them, you won't believe what's there, and particularly what is not in those books. It's always the dog that does not bark in the night that's important to see and listen to. Our history has changed. Scholarly history has changed significantly, 180 degrees since the 1960s. However, that change in scholarship has not yet seeped into our classrooms. Bits and pieces of it are there, but there still aren't the curriculum materials, the teachers prepared, the communities willing to accept the kind of history I believe ought to be taught in those schools. Just as a point of personal privilege, I'm trying to organize and to write a new book called, for high schools and middle schools, called Hoosiers of Color. If anyone has $500,000 to support that enterprise to publish such a book, I can tell you where to send the check. Okay, your immediate question is a very important one about the coming of more African Americans to Indiana. There were African Americans in Indiana from the very beginning, from the time when the most people here were French and Native American. There were African Americans, always African Americans. But in the late 19th and early 20th century, the numbers increased, and this is the Great Migration. On that book, that list of books I sent you, is Isabel Wilkerson's book, and it's a wonderful book, a great read on the Great Migration of Southerners to the North, and they came to Indianapolis and South Bend and Fort Wayne and Lake County and made a huge difference, providing the labor that fueled the industrial progress of those days, but also causing a lot of whites to say, as you say, Deborah, whoa, too many of them are coming here. What are we going to do about this? They're moving into our neighborhoods. What are we going to do? They're going to our schools. And you know what? The other side of it is our daughters are going to Indiana Avenue to dance. Boy, in the 1920s, did that upset the Ku Klux Klan? You're laughing, Deborah. You can talk about that. You can talk about that if you want to. So it's the Great Migration, large numbers of African Americans. And they were many of them uneducated. They were almost as undesirable, not just because of race, because of other factors, as the immigrants from Poland and Sicily who show up and who aren't even regarded as fully white in the 1920s. So this created a lot of concern. And one of the responses was to build high schools like Crispus Attucks to keep these kids from going to Shortridge and the other public schools in Indianapolis. And this happened in Gary, it happened in Evansville, and other places.
One of the unforeseen consequences, and I just want to point this out, is that Attucks produced a couple of generations of brilliant African-American scholars, professionals, doctors. The city was built on the excellence of that school. Many of the teachers there could not find jobs other places, were well-educated, master's degree, doctorates, and they were teaching in high school. I was one of those who went to Shortridge through the integration period, and I didn't know nearly as much about my own history as those people who went to Attucks. So it was not their intent to make a brilliant class of African Americans, but they did.
Yeah.
And I think that should be pointed out. It was probably one of the superior schools in the city.
You're absolutely right, Deborah. And those kids at Attucks were learning about Black history. I've seen their curriculum. You probably weren't learning much of that at Shortridge, but they did at Attucks. I want to mention again, this point you just made about the quality of education and the Attucks alumni is one that comes through brilliantly in the WWII film on Attucks. It's just full of this sort of thing.
Yeah.
My favorite Attucks alumni, I wrote an article about him, is Willard Ransom, who graduated went to Attucks and eventually goes to Harvard Law School in the class of 1938, the only African-American in the Harvard Law School class of 38. And by 1947 is back in Indiana and head of the Indiana NAACP and plays a huge role before civil rights in moving toward school desegregation and other legal issues, leads protests in downtown Indianapolis against segregated restaurants. So yes, an Attucks alum, and there are lots of them like this.
No, there are. I have one in my family who went on to IU to get her PhD when it was a very small group of them who were getting doctorates at IU at that time. So it's interesting that I have that history. I really wanted to say something, go to another thing that just for our readers, our listeners to know. The lynching in Marion, Indiana, that was so pivotal, really spawned a famous song by Nina Simone.
Yes.
She wrote the song Strange Fruit.
Yes.
And for those who haven't heard the song, it's worth listening to because the strange fruit from the tree were the men being lynched. And I just think it's one of those things to know that song sprang from that incident in Marion. And we also don't think often about Marion or Indiana being a center for lynching. And I wanted to say too, I think the worst nightmare of the Klan, the very worst nightmare, has come to fruition. Your president is a Catholic. Your vice president is a person of color, and the husband of the vice president is a Jew. That, I think, is why we're having so many current issues.
And there's a gay guy who's Secretary of Transportation. It gets worse and worse, doesn't it?
Oh, it goes down. I mean, it's just everything they hated is now leading the country. And I don't know if they were brilliant enough to know that and fight it, or it's just they were just so dumb they didn't know. But I think it's important to point out that is true. And I'd like for you to discuss this. Some of the rise of the groups now, they're not called the Klan, but certainly it's just a renaming. Is this a backlash to where we are as a country?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, it's a backlash. I mean, first of all, this form of protest, and particularly what we saw at the Capitol on January 6th, and all sorts of other examples we've had, Charlottesville in Virginia in 2017. These are not unusual in American history. This is not an aberration. These are not fluke events. These are deep in our history. We've had other examples of them. It's just that coming at this point in our history, where maybe in 2008, so many of us had hope for a better America, and coming now is so disappointing, terribly depressing to me. But it's the kind of backlash I talked about in 1964 when Wallace came to Indiana. It's the kind of space that opens up when white Americans feel uncomfortable, threatened, their world is changing, those people are getting out of place, and you can add to the list of those people. And so it's terribly, terribly disconcerting. And I say this not to comfort, but not to dismiss any of that. I think this is very, very serious stuff. I think the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo and all those guys are an affront to our democracy. But I want to say again, it's not just the people who showed up inside the Capitol building, as much as they attract our attention. It's the leaders, it's the ones who really ought to know better. Some of them are graduates of Harvard or Yale Law School. And they do know better. And how they can behave and speak and act the way they do, it's a tragedy.
It is. What concerns me as an African American right now, with the somewhat unleashing of these things we knew there was still racism, there's no question about that, but we thought we had gotten to a place of being civil, and we've lost that. And we've also lost, as an African American, and I speak for myself, the comfort of going places. I'm not sure anymore when I see someone white where they are, and particularly in Indiana, where there's not a lot of diversity in our political system in terms of leadership. Indiana still looks like the 1950s in terms of leadership, in terms of opinion, in terms of a lot of things. So that we're back to a place of not knowing who is the friend and who is the enemy. And that's a very uncomfortable place. And in Indiana, there seems to be no backlash for our senator saying, I'm totally on one side. I mean, it's acceptable. The last political voting, our Indiana people, many who ran for office, big flags, I'm for Trump, I'm for Trump, I'm a Trumpster, and they won election. So it's a very uncomfortable time in Indiana. It's not one, we're talking inclusion, but we don't see it. I think it's part of our history, but we don't face it. So it's not, I think people need to understand that. This is a very cautionary time.
I'm glad to hear you say that. Your words are an expression of the tragedy and the cost that African Americans especially are paying, and other people who look or seem different to white America. And I agree with you. With not having, I have white male privilege. I don't have to feel uncomfortable going places, but I can get some sense of what you're talking about, Deborah, and a great appreciation. You used the word unleashing, and I think that's very important. The Klan did that in the 1920s. They unleashed, often in nice words, hatred and bigotry and exclusion. They tried very hard and very successfully to make those things seem normal, acceptable to good people. And that's exactly what has happened in the last 4 years. That's what Trump did, what his enablers did, and what they're still trying to do. And in Indiana, we do have, I believe, a special challenge. I'm particularly upset by the nature of our legislature, our General Assembly. And I'll say this as a citizen, with every right to speak my mind on this subject. You don't have to agree with me, but I think it's not good for anyone to have one party have such dominance and such control and no checks and balances of any consequence, no one really watching them capably from the other side, from the media, and from the citizens. And they're getting away with stuff that's not right. And they're avoiding subjects that they ought to be addressing. Like, let's just say, pass a decent hate bill, for example, or all sorts of other possibilities to make Indiana a better place, a more attractive place for the next generation. And Indiana has paid, I think, is going to pay an increasingly large price for what you've just described, Deborah. What you've just described is a place not comfortable for people of color.
Yeah. And I have worked in 47 counties. And I can tell you that I've had incidents in the last 10 years that were racial. And I always have the thought when I walk in, it's just going to be okay. 8 times out of 10 it is. But there are times when it's not. And this is very, Indiana has to work on this. Whether Indiana likes it or not, America is changing. The demographics are changing. We're gonna, if we want to be a part of the growth and the bright future, we're gonna have to really take a hard look at our history and what's still underlying some of that is happening yet today. It just is really important.
I agree with that, and I just want to add to the element of race, the element of gender. And I know there are women watching this who could tell stories too. All women could, of ways in which they were denied, and the ceiling hit them as they tried to move up, and the ways in which they were made uncomfortable. And again, we have leaders in Indiana, a growing number of women, but not nearly enough. Certainly, again, in our General Assembly, not nearly enough women. And so I think Women for Change is a very, very important part of building the kind of Indiana that you and I would like to see, Deborah.
Absolutely. And women, like other groups, we are diverse. We don't all say or believe the same things. And one of the things Indiana does is isolates women who aren't conservative enough. You know, we really have a good way of blocking the voices of the broad spectrum of women. And we have to remember, you know, and it's one of my things, that women's suffrage is 100 years old, but African-American women only got that vote in 1965. So there's a real disparity. And we, as I speak now as African-American, are really, really focused on not being left behind again. You know, if you look at the history, every right that has been granted or assumed for white males has been a struggle. And the last one to get it has been African-American women. So when we talk about Women for Change, we want to march together hand in hand with all of our sisters to really usher in a time where women's voices and concerns and power are heard.
I agree with you, and that may be a way to finish our conversation, because I just want to say on that, absolutely 100% agreement.
Thank you so much for this conversation today, and I hope we can continue it at some point and really delve into some other issues very deeply, because this is really about the future. It's about our children, and it's about how we as a people want to be remembered. So thank you so much. Thank you for your scholarship, and thank you for this conversation today.
Thank you, Deborah.